says, Torrijos got his family together and he said, I'm probably next, but it's okay because I've done what I came here to do. I've renegotiated the canal. The canal will now be in our hands. He just finished negotiating the treaty with Jimmy Carter. So I've accomplished what I need to accomplish. I'm ready to die if that's what it's going to take. And he had dreams about an airplane crash. In June of that same year, just a couple of months later, he also went down in an airplane crash, which there's no question was, executed by CIA-sponsored jackals.
You said it was a pass-off of a radio, I think?
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of evidence that one of the security guards, one of Torrijos' security guards, handed him at the last moment as he was getting on the plane a tape recorder, a small tape recorder that contained a bomb. Well, Panama is a very interesting example because I tried to corrupt Omar Torrijos and bring him around, a great man as far as I was concerned. And I was very torn. On the one level, I didn't want to corrupt him. I really respected him for his integrity. On the other level, it was my job to corrupt him, and I knew that if I didn't, something more dire was likely to happen, which it did. He was assassinated. And that sent Panama into a tailspin. The soul was taken out of the country at that point in many respects. And eventually, Noriega became president. Noriega had been, we now know, a CIA agent. He'd been paid a lot of money to help fight the Colombia drug cartel, so he was one of our guys. And we figured that once Noriega was in power, that we now could basically reverse the canal treaty that Torrijos had struck with Carter, and turn that around and also reinstate the School of the Americas, the U.S. military bases in Panama, but Noriega wouldn't do it. He wasn't as much of a puppet as we thought he was. He wasn't willing to reverse those policies. Also, he continued what had begun under Torrijos with negotiations with the Japanese about financing and building a sea-level canal. We didn't want to see that happen. If there was going to be a sea-level canal, we wanted to finance and build it. And Noriega refused to drop out of those negotiations. So he was no longer our puppet. He wasn't playing the game. And on top of all of that, there's a lot of rumors, and I don't have any evidence to back this up. If there was evidence, it was destroyed. But there was an island off the coast of Panama called Contador, which I do know very well. It's still there. It's a resort. And in the 70s, this was a place where deals were struck and where you could take people on private yachts or however you wanted to do it. And there was plenty of cocaine, all kinds of drugs, sex, all kinds of illicit activities, and whatever happened on Contador stayed on Contador. And this was a common knowledge. I mean, I used it. I took people there. I bribed people on Contador. Everybody was doing it that was involved in South America. And so the question has always been asked, we wanted to take out Noriega. Okay, why did we bomb a city? Why did we kill between 2,000 and 6,000 innocent civilians and destroy this part of the city? And I was just in Panama a couple of weeks ago. It was amazing. I traveled around, went down to that part of the city. I talked to people from taxi drivers to government officials about all of this. And, they're still furious at the United States. Why did we do that? We could have taken out Noriega. He was not that difficult to take out. That's our goal. But we didn't have to go in and bomb the section of the city. The best explanation I've heard, the most logical one that I can come up with, is that one of the buildings down there belonged to the military or the national security forces. Panama really didn't have an army per se, but it had these national security forces. And this building was totally demolished. There's a lot of eyewitnesses who say once it was demolished, a special unit of the U.S. military went in and made sure that everything was demolished. People saw this. I've talked to people. And the rumor was that within that building there were a lot of photographs of things that went on in Contadora. That Noriega, unlike Torrijos, had put cameras up. Torrijos was very adamant nothing would ever leave, and he didn't have any cameras, I'm pretty sure, but that Noriega did. And he had photographs, and including very compromising photographs of the president, the first President Bush's son, the current President Bush, before he was president, that they had some very compromising photographs of him and a lot of high-up politicians and businessmen. Now, again, I have no evidence of this. If those photographs existed, they were destroyed because they would have been kept in that building. And it's the only explanation I've ever heard that makes sense to me as to why we went in and destroyed that particular part of the city, which was very vulnerable. A lot of old buildings around that we knew once we sent in some fire bombs, the whole place had to go. And there were a tremendous number of very poor, innocent people living there. Between 2,000 and 6,000 died, depending on whose records. The United States admits something like 2,000. Panamanians say 6,000. Why would we have done that? That certainly is an explanation. The precedent for economic hitmen really began back in the early 50s when a president was elected in Iran, prime minister, democratically elected, Mossadegh, and he was considered to be the hope for democracy in the Middle East and around the world. He was Time Magazine's Man of the Year in 1951. But one of the things that he'd run on and began to implement was the idea that foreign oil companies needed to pay the Iranian people a lot more for the oil that they were taking out of Iran. The Iranian people should benefit from their own oil. Strange policy. And so once he took office, he began to implement this, including even threats and nationalizing foreign oil companies, particularly British Oil Company, which today is BP. We didn't like that, of course. But we were afraid to do what we normally were doing at that time, which was to send in the military, as we'd done in other parts of the world, because Iran was right on the border with Russia. Russia was now the primary enemy of ours, and Russia had nuclear weapons. And we very much feared a nuclear war. So we determined early on that we shouldn't take the normal position and send in the military into Iran. Instead, we sent in one CIA agent, Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's relative. And Kermit went in with a few $1 million and was very, very effective and efficient. And in a short amount of time, spending a few $1 million, he managed to get Mossadegh overthrown and brought in the Shah of Iran to replace him. So he overthrew this democratically elected president, replaced him with a dictator who always was favorable to oil. And it was extremely effective. So back here in the United States, in Washington, people looked around and said, wow, that was easy and cheap and not messy. And so this established a whole new way of manipulating countries, of creating empire. The only problem with Roosevelt was that he was a card-carrying CIA agent, and had he been caught, the ramifications could have been pretty serious. So very quickly at that point, the decision was made to use private consultants to channel the money through the World Bank or the IMF or one of the other such agencies, to bring in people like me who worked for private companies, so that if we got caught, there would be no governmental ramifications connected with this. And it is interesting to me how this system has continued pretty much the same way for years and years and years, except the economic hitmen have got better and better and better, so we've more and more subtle. But then we come up with, very recently, what happened in Venezuela. In 1998, Hugo Chavez gets elected president, following a long line of presidents who had been very corrupt and basically destroyed the economy of the country, put the largest middle class in Latin America had suddenly become impoverished because they put the country into such debt and people into debt. And Chavez was elected amidst all that. Now, Chavez was not a radical opposed to the United States at that point in time. But after 9/11, Chavez went on the record of saying, I hope that the people of the United States will see what's going on here and understand that there's a lot of anger and resentment in the world. And that was resented in Washington, that he would say that. And so a campaign was launched to make him look like a villain. And then in 2002, a coup was staged, which there's no question in my mind, and most other people's minds, that the CIA was behind that coup. But Chavez was very smart, and he had people hidden in the palace and so on, and plus he had the people in the streets, took to the streets, and the huge numbers of poor people in Venezuela took to the streets and demanded his return. And so he came back into power. And yeah, the way that coup was fomented was very reflective of what Kermit Roosevelt had done in Iran, of paying people to go out into the streets to riot, to protest, to say this Chavez is very unpopular. And if you can get a few thousand people to do that, television and can make it look like it's the whole country, and things start to mushroom. So it was very reminiscent of that, except in the case of Chavez, he was smart enough, and the people were so strongly behind him and so expecting this to happen that they overcame it, which was a phenomenal moment in the history of Latin America. Because regardless of what one thinks of Chavez, and I personally have my problems with his rhetoric and his behavior sometimes, but the fact that he has stood up to the United States, and he's done it primarily demanding that Venezuelan oil be used to help the Venezuelan people. That has always been his philosophy. And his success at actually making that happen has its ups and downs, but that's always been the philosophy. And also to use some of that money to help other poor people throughout the continent. The fact that that happened encouraged other countries like Bolivia and Ecuador and Chile and Argentina and Brazil and Uruguay and Nicaragua and Guatemala and so many others to hold democratic elections and vote in presidents who said, our resources must serve our people. So Correa of Ecuador ran on a campaign basically that says the profits from Ecuadorian oil must help Ecuador's poor people. And Morales ran on a campaign that said the profits from Bolivia's gas must help Bolivia's poor people. And I don't think that would have been possible had it not been for what Chavez did. So I think history will look back and see this man as being a very key figure in what's really occurring in Latin America today, which is a true nonviolent revolution. There's a democratic revolution happening south of the Rio Grande, and it's very, very significant, more significant than most people in the United States realize. More than 80% of the population of South America in the last democratic elections has voted in the president that said, no more exploitation by the corporotocracy. Our resources must help our people. And it's been nonviolent. It's been democratic. It's an amazing process that's going on. Iraq actually is a perfect example of the way the whole system works. So we economic hitmen are the first line of defense. We go in and we try to corrupt governments and get them to accept these huge loans, which we then use as leverage to basically own them. If we fail, as I failed in Panama with Omar Torrijos and in Ecuador with Jaime Roldos, men who refuse to be corrupted, then the second line of defense is we send in the jackals. And the jackals either overthrow governments or they assassinate the people who won't be corrupted. In the case of both Omar Torrijos and Jaime Roldos, they were assassinated because I failed. And once that happens and a new government comes in, and boy, it's going to toe the line because the new president knows what will happen if he doesn't. In the case of Iraq, both of those things failed. Economic hitmen were not able to get through to Saddam Hussein. We tried very hard. We tried to get him to accept a deal very similar to what the House of Saud had accepted in Saudi Arabia, an amazing deal from our standpoint, but he wouldn't accept it. And so the jackals went in to take him out. They couldn't do it. His security was very good. After all, he had one time worked for the CIA. He'd been hired to assassinate a former president of Iraq and failed, but he knew the system, and he had these look-alike doubles. It's very hard to assassinate a president unless there's people on the inside helping you. And if the people on the inside don't even know whether they're guarding the real guy or a double, it makes it very difficult for them and very, very risky for them. So we couldn't take him out. So in '91, the first President Bush sent in the troops, and we figured at that point, which is the last step. If the economic hitmen fail, the jackals fail, then we send in the military. And of course, all these people always know that the military is standing off in the wings to go in if everything else fails. So in '91, we send in the troops, and we take out the Iraqi military. So we assume at that point that Saddam Hussein is going to come around. We could have taken him out, of course, at that time. But we didn't want to. He's the kind of strong man we like. He controls his people. We thought he could control the Kurds and keep the Iranians in their border and keep pumping oil for us. And that once we took out his military, now he's going to come around. So the economic hitmen go back in the 90s without success. If they'd had success, he'd still be running the country. We'd be selling him all the fighter jets he wants and everything else he wants. But they couldn't. They didn't have success. The jackals couldn't take him out again. So we sent the military in once again, and this time we did the complete job, and took him out, and in the process created for ourselves some very, very lucrative construction